Welcome to another episode of Cheers Dears. We are continuing our spooky season with horror author Bob Evans. Bob, welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here.
Now, Bob, I had the honor of reading your collection of horror short stories, and it was so much fun, and I would love to hear more about them.
Well, sure. I mean, the collection, Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, which are all stories which did well but did not win in the Writers of the Future contest, hence that title. They do tend toward the darker and the horror elements. I haven't written any horror in long form yet, any novels of horror length. All my horror so far has been short form. And the inspiration comes from everywhere. As I was saying in our green room before the show started, horror has always been a part of my life. My earliest memories are of horror films.
They left an impression, huh?
They did. I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina until I was 10. And so movies were drive-in movies. And drive-in movies in the mid to late 60s in the South, there was its own circuit of films. I mean, this is where Herschel Gordon Lewis really reigned, and Roger Corman, and some films which only ever played on the Southern drive-in circuit. And there were a lot of very colorful horror films that were part of that circuit.
So what is it about horror that really appeals to you? What was it about those movies that captivated your imagination?
Well, it's hard to say what is appeals to me. I mean, because it's always been there. It's sort of like the fish and water thing. It's like, it's hard to differentiate horror from my life because, like I said, it's always been a part of it. I mean, ghost stories have always had a particular fascination for me. Some people are into zombies, some people are into vampires, some people are into werewolves. For me, it's a good ghost story. And to me, the best horror stories are the ones that have that frisson where even after you finish the story, the book, or the show or the movie, it stays with you. You think about it. It leaves you unsettled. For me, horror is more than, a slasher with a knife. That's fine, and there have been those movies I've enjoyed, and I'm not going to ick anyone's wow if that's what you love. But for me, I want something that has a little more resonance thematically, that leaves you unsettled in the way you look at life and the way you look at things.
And that's definitely elements within your stories. In the Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, there were two in particular that very much stayed with me. And one was the first, which was about the hitchhiker and how the character, I'm trying not to do spoilers, but how the main character picks up a hitchhiker on the side of the road and the consequences of that, and how tragedies that didn't even occur in his life or as his doing were coming back to haunt him. And it was just a really fascinating story of, we always hear that phrase, you can't blame the children for the father's sins, but here we have that exact situation happening. And that definitely stayed with me a few days.
No, I'm glad it stayed with you. One of the things I played with in that one, that's the House of Bad Blood, is I wanted to play with, a recurring theme in ghost stories is the unresolved mystery, the thing that needs to be done to put the ghost to rest. And it's like, well, what happens if that is something that is nearly impossible to achieve? That, you think you know what the ghost needs, but it isn't. I think particularly the American rendition of The Ring did a very good job on that. The Japanese version of the film had a slightly different take, and both takes are very different from the novel. But that, like I said, ghosts, that's just what I love about, I remember being 6 or 7 and having a book of ghost stories.
Oh, fun. Now, I have to ask, have you ever had a paranormal experience?
The amusing thing is that I'm a rationalist. yeah, it takes a lot for me to believe in something. It's like, okay, you gotta really convince me. Um, and it's like if vengeful ghosts were a possible thing, great portions of our globe would be uninhabitable. You
That's
know,
very true.
I mean, just think of Eastern Europe or the American plains. If vengeful ghosts were a thing, that would, and that was the basis of a story which I'm trying to remember which magazine it appeared in. I wrote one, Proof of Principle, which explored that very concept that if ghosts were a thing, and if someone could basically activate all of them, it would be the end of everything.
So all you writers out there, that sounds like a good apocalypse story right there. Well, how what a good point and how interesting. And I always find it so I have to ask everybody who's involved in horror if they've ever had some related
Yeah.
experience that they draw from. But I also think that, with us horror authors, we tend to have these extraordinary imaginations. Now, I'm not downgrading anybody, any other type of author, any other kind of genre author. But horror, like you were saying, even if they're just slashers, tend to have, and most stories do. I'm going to backtrack on this. And if I'm offending anybody, please let me know. I'd be happy to apologize next episode. But there's just this greater leap of imagination that tends to happen. And horror writers, I think, will often go deeper and darker and explore different facets of human characters, human characteristics that not every author wants to touch. And so, we do write about the serial killers, we do write about the paranormal, we do write about the aliens or the technology taking over. And we hit those darker recesses of the imagination. And it's a trip.
Yeah. Well, when you have a character who is terrified, that you've stripped away enough of control and understanding of the world that they are truly terrified, that's also when you get to see the real character, I think. And
Mm,
it's similar to the Greek tragedy theory that it's only in the tragedies when your fate is inescapable that the true character is revealed. I think horror has a semblance to that, you know, and horror to me is also that the element of you think the world works one way and it doesn't.
mm,
It's one of the reasons why vampire films or stories are so hard to be good horror these days, is because we've got such well established rules that we can just kind of slot them in and we know how they work. And if you know how something works, it can be scary to be in the situation, but it's not really horrifying.
right.
Um, I've seen various panel and writer discussion groups the definition of horror being, there's a knock at your door at midnight, you open the door and there's a clown, you know, because the clown is unexpected. It's not, it doesn't belong. And that's a good one. One that
Yeah.
keeps floating in my mind, though, is, and this is an experience I think nearly everyone has had. It's when you walk into a dark stairwell and you miss that first step,
Mm,
and you have that, you knew there was a step there, but there isn't, and there's that split second moment when you're falling but not yet fallen. That is horror, except it just extends on. That's what I
mm.
would love to someday really capture in my writing. I don't know if I've ever gotten there, but that's the goal.
You're doing great. Let me tell you. I have to ask, are there any particular books or movies? Or I know you were talking about movies earlier, but is there any particular one that you find really inspired some of your writing?
um, well, I mean, there are a lot of really good horror authors out there, and of course, we can talk about King, who is the the annihilating asteroid of horror. Nothing survives being around King. He will
Right.
swamp everything off in terms of discussion. But there's also, I wish I should have looked up the author of this one story that I read 25 years ago, and it still stays with me because, well, it was a ghost story, so of course it's right in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And it starts with a man who wakes up in bed. His wife kind of stirs. He's gotten a phone call. Um, he's a doctor. He works with a priest. They go out finding ghosts, and they've discovered that ghosts are created when someone does an attempt to resuscitate someone who has died and fails, and that creates the
Oh,
ghost in this setting. And the ghosts wander around, cause trouble. So he and the priest go around and basically, with like a blessed spike, nail the ghost down someplace so it can't wander around and cause trouble. They can't get rid of it. It's just going to be there forever now, nailed to wherever
huh.
they nailed it. And so the story is them chasing this one particular ghost in the subway. At the end of the story, he goes back, lays down in his bed. His wife again kind of stirs, but of course, not really, because she's a ghost. She's been nailed there because he tried to save her even after he knew this might happen. And
Oh,
every night
wow.
he's in the bed with her. Like, just thinking about it gives me chills. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
hard to me because you're going to keep thinking about that. It's not
Yeah.
about the bloodletting. It's not about the gore. And King can get there. I mean, The
Yeah.
Shining. Oh, no film I think can ever properly do The Shining justice because it's such a psychological story. And
Right.
it stays with you afterwards. And Salem's Lot, which
Mhm.
was sort of a rational exploration of vampires, because if you had vampires, it would very quickly just, like the pandemic, be everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those psychological thrillers. I think there's something about them. Like you said, it's that they stay with you and make you wonder what if, and how would I have reacted in this situation? What could I have done differently? Could I have anticipated anything differently? And I absolutely love those. And I think one of my favorite ones, which gets a lot of criticism, but it just took me to that what if place, was The Village. Shyamalan's portrayal of these people who we thought were in a totally different context than they were, and then only to realize, oh my God, they're in Pennsylvania. I mean, it was such a mind-bending moment of, wow, could be a reality somewhere. This could be something that's happening. And the monsters they created were created. And it was just incredible. I really enjoyed those that make you stop and think a little bit.
Yeah, it was very much, I think, Shyamalan's exploration of a modern take on folk horror.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Folk horror is one of those subgenres that also interests me. You have ghosts and folk horror, both very, very fascinating to me. Um, I was been 16 when I saw The Wicker Man for the first time, and that left an impression. And of course, I'm talking about the original Wicker Man from
Right.
1973, not the misogynistic remake. No, that does not exist. It's no. But
I'm
folk
gonna be really
horror.
curious.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was gonna say, like, the folklore coming, that's a really interesting genre because Candyman certainly falls into that. And I'm going to be really I haven't seen it yet, but I'll be curious to see the remake that they do. And another one that was really good, that was a book that came out more recently, was The Outsiders. I think that was what it was called, The Outsider. And that was another one that played on shapeshifting. And that was really fascinating. I think HBO did a series of it.
Yes,
I like the book better, but the series was good.
yes, they did. They did do an adaptation. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just didn't quite hook me. That's not me saying it was bad. It's just like, things, work or don't work for you.
Right.
As I constantly say in our writers group, your mileage may vary. Simply because I didn't like the piece doesn't mean it's bad. It just, it didn't work for me. Um,
Right.
and but the best horror, well, the best stories in general, but horror is definitely part of that, is when it has a thematic resonance that's beyond just the story.
Mm.
Um, you know, eh, Most people, if not everyone, is familiar to some extent with the 1941 The Wolf Man with Lon Chaney Jr. Yeah, it was one of the part of Universal classics. Um, but if you go back before that, werewolf mythology was all mixed up because there are all sorts of shape shifting myths of Europe and such. And what Siadmak, the writer, was actually writing about, because he was a German Jew refugee fleeing Nazi Germany. He was writing about Nazism with the werewolf, how your
Hmm.
neighbor can become the monster, how someone who is good can become bad. And to me, you don't
Wow.
want to make the metaphor so obvious that you feel like you're being preached at, but you want it in there. You want to be saying something.
I feel like you gave us quite a few of those warnings with some of your stories too about cautioning us of going too far with technology. And I felt this very transcendental ring about that of us going too far and making this perfect world, which is actually hell. And I absolutely, that one too was the other one that really stuck with me of, everything around me is an electronic device and does everything for me. And I barely have to think, hey, Google's a second away.
Yeah,
So that was one that also really stuck with me and made me
yeah.
think for a bit.
What everyone wanted, which actually was my first sale as a fiction piece. Um, and that one again, we see all again and again the idea that sentient machines will turn and try to annihilate humanity. Why? You know, it's more frightening if they don't want to annihilate us, if they just want to take care of us. We can have everything we want if we're willing to give up all our control.
Yeah.
And this, I am by far not the first author to tread that path. This was tread very well in a 1970-71 film called Colossus: The Forbidden Project,
Hmm.
which is out on Blu-ray. You can get it. It's a wonderful early 70s film about artificial intelligence and the danger of artificial intelligence deciding it knows better than what we do.
Yeah. Now, Bob, when
um,
you're writing, do you have a process or a zone that you have to get into to get yourself into your stories?
um, I maintain the hardest part of writing is butt to chair, fingers to keyboard. You know, um,
Yep.
it's so much easier to do anything other than to actually sit down and do the writing, even when you love what you're doing about it. You're like, yeah, that's a cool story. You sit down, oh, look, YouTube's right there. you know, I
What?
can
Who does that?
I can watch Australians reacting to the lighthouse. That's a lot easier than writing. So that's the hardest part. As far as the actual process, I have to know my ending before I can start writing. You know,
Mm,
if it's long form, it's novels or such, I have to have an outline. I'm an outliner. That's not to disparage anybody who is an organic writer or a pantser, because you got to do what works for you.
right.
But for me, the ending is so critical. The ending is where it all comes together. It's where theme, character, plot, story all unify for a purpose. And if I don't know what that is, how can I write it? And I've
Mm,
seen so many stories fall apart at the end. It's like, nah, you didn't get there. You messed
yeah.
something up, and now you didn't stick the landing, and that just weakens the whole piece to me. Um, Now I have friends who are pantsers, and that just means that after you write it, you have to go back and do more rewrites than an outliner does, because you have to make it work to that ending. But I have to have it in mind. I have to know, because to me that's the point of writing the story.
Mm,
Um, and so, with short form, I usually don't have an outline. Short story, I usually just have the good, clear, single concept that's driving the story and where it's going to take it. And then there I can just kind of invent it as I go along.
I really like that. And that's something that I try to do as well. When I was in college, I had a professor who told us to write out our thesis on a post-it note and stick it at the top of our computer so that we could make visual eye contact with it throughout writing the piece so we knew where we were going. And that is something that I have continued with my stories as well, where I try to write at least the premise of what I want to happen so that I don't lose focus and don't start to wander away, because it's so easy to do. And it's totally fine if it changes, but as long as that change reflects a whole piece at the end. Because I agree. I've also read quite a few novels where I'm like, wait, this doesn't add up at
Yeah,
all. It was a good story, but the ending kind of crashed.
endings are absolutely critical. There was
Yeah.
one novel, it was not a horror novel, it's a science fiction novel I was reading. It was like one of the first novels I read on a electronic device, on an ebook. And this ebook reader didn't give you page numbers or how many pages are left. And I got to the last page and I kept trying to turn it, then realized the book is over. And like, no, you can't stop. That's not an ending. It's like, and it's like, some long form television, people ask, what do you think of this series? I'm like, I'll let you know when I get to the end. Because
Mhm.
until I see how they end it, I don't know if it was a good project or not.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I totally agree.
that's probably part of the reason why I never got involved with The Walking Dead, is because I could see that was going to be like, but where are you going?
Mm,
It's going to, it just, I watched the pilot, and there are many of zombie films I really enjoy, but I think there's a very difference between doing a film, a contained story, and a film is more like a short story or a novella. If you think about in terms
right.
of plot, character, what it is, encompassing, and in a series that's expected to go on for multiple seasons. Um, I mean, I've got my collection of zombie movies, like
Yeah.
but again, most of them, only a few of them really say something. You
Yeah.
know, Night of the Living Dead, the
I was gonna
original.
say that's probably one of the best of all time.
Well, I would actually say the best zombie movie of all time is Train to Busan.
Yes.
I,
Yes.
it had
Holy
everything.
cow.
It had horror, it had action, and at the heart, it had real characters that had real dimensionality to them. That
Yeah.
even at the end, you realize, they showed you that the villain's motivation, the guy who was messing up everything, he had a very relatable human motivation.
Yeah.
And to me, that's very important because nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I'm evil. I'm going to
Right.
do
They have a
evil.
backstory.
They have a justification, they have a motivation, they
Yeah.
have a reason why they think they deserve this, or that they've been wronged, or that they're saving the world from something. And they may be horribly, horribly deluded and doing evil things,
Yeah.
but they believe in themselves. And that's the difference between a hero and a villain. Isn't their motivation or what they're trying to achieve. To me, it's the methods by which they achieve it.
Mm.
I think Bryan Singer and his writers for the very first X-Men film captured this very well in the very first X-Men movie, when Magneto's put Rogue up into the device, so she will die powering the device and not him. And Wolverine says, "If you were so noble, it'd be you up there." That's the difference between a hero and a villain. A hero would put themselves
Mm-hmm.
there. A villain puts someone else up there against their will.
Very well defined. And I agree with you that it's those character moments that whether you're doing a short story, a novel, whatever, showing us the depth of the characters is so important. The flaws, the peaks of their characters, so that we understand the why behind what they are doing, even if it's just subtle little things like opening the door for somebody or just not opening the door, slamming it
Mm-hmm.
into their face. That's just little micro details that we can throw in that really add those layers and make the characters more relatable or more despisable, but at least we have a leg of empathy towards them, maybe, if we understand what their reasonings for the why.
Yeah, I will say that, my fiction tends not to have villains. I don't tend to write villains who are out with, you know, villain's going to achieve A, so hero has to stop him from getting A. One, that's just a plot. That's not a story.
Yeah.
I draw a distinct line between plot and story. Plot is the objective. It is the hero wants this or to happen or this not to happen, and he has obstacles, or she or they, and if they can achieve or not achieve it, that's the plot. The story is what makes it unique to that character.
Hmm.
um and I always try to find a character, because there's lots of plots out there.
Yeah.
Most James Bond movies are plots, they don't have stories. James Bond goes in and comes out of the movie exactly the same. He
Mm-hmm.
has not changed. You could put any super competent spy in there and it would be the exact same.
Right.
But there are a few,
Right.
Casino Royale, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, um, that shake that up, and those are the ones that stay with me. And that's what I try to look for. Whether in horror fiction, it's still about the character. Um,
Yeah.
Danny in Ari Aster's Midsommar. You know, you couldn't put anyone else in there and have that same story happen. It had to be
Right.
her.
That's all excellent points, Bob. And that brings us to one of our listener questions, which comes from Tiffany G, who's one of my newsletter subscribers. And she would like to know, okay, if you could add one book to any high school curriculum, what would it be and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
There can be a few if
um,
it's hard to choose just one.
well, it's also tough because of my personal background. I came from a high school which was not the best high school in the world, so I didn't have that sort of experience where there was a lot of assigned reading. Um, uh, I'm going to go with a lesser known science fiction book, though, that I think, because I think it has a lot of interesting themes buried in it, which is Stinger by Nancy Kress. It's
Ooh, I'll have to
it's
add that to my list.
it's hard SF about a engineered plague that is causing African Americans to have strokes.
Huh.
And it was contemporary for when it was written, which I think is late 80s. Um, and I think she does that rare talent of good hard SF, good hard science with good characters that are rich and fully developed and give us a real insight into theme about, the theme of this is about assumptions about racism. And she also writes both genders very well, so I'd pick that one.
Very nice. And our next listener question comes from Amanda, who's also one of our newsletter subscribers. And she asks, which I'm actually going to ask all of the horror writers I interview because it's fantastic. It is, have you ever scared yourself with something you wrote?
It's kind of the other way around, is that I will have a nightmare that will scare me and it will become the story. Um, uh, I I get tense, I get suspenseful in the stuff I write, and sometimes the stuff I write will change the way I view the world because I've crawled into a character's head and I've trying to give an honest view for what they're looking at, and then I'll come back and realize, huh, maybe I should have been looking at it that way the whole time. um, but actually frightening me, I don't think so. It's like I said, it's the other way around. Like one of the stories in Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, Araceli, was directly inspired by a nightmare I had. Because I do this odd thing. I don't know if I've ever met anyone else who actually does what this happen to them, but I dream in movies. Sometimes I'm not in the dream. It is a movie with recognizable actors. Like, oh, that's Tony Perkins and that's Dan Hedaya. I was like, and it has cuts and dissolves. So I was like, not all my dreams, but I've never met anyone else who had that. And Araceli was one of those.
And that was a really interesting movie. That made me think of I think The Thing. I think it's The Thing, the older one, but it had that feeling of going to a remote location where something is coming after them, and how do they fight it? Can they fight it? That one was really interesting, and I loved your author notes at the end of each one of these stories, because then that helps to us as the readers dive a bit more into your world as well.
Well, I've always appreciated that when I see that in short story collections where the author gives a little explanation about, why they wrote it or what they were thinking about, But that's because, I'm a bonus material junkie. I love knowing the why behind things.
Me too. Whenever I see that as an option, or well, we don't really do DVDs as much anymore, but sometimes HBO will do it, the behind the scenes things. How did this come to be? I love that.
Yeah, the bonus material for the re-release of the 33 King Kong is longer than the 33 King Kong.
I could see that actually. That
But it's
I'm gonna go
wonderful.
find that. That sounds interesting. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us here. Can you let the people know where they can find you?
Certainly, certainly. Well, my writing is always under Robert Mitchell Evans. full name, because there's a Midwest restaurant called Bob Evans, so they already had the domain name. And if you go robertmitchellevans.com, you'll see my blog. And you can find me on Facebook and on Twitter. And my short horror fiction is available as, Horseshoes and Hand Grenades by Robert Mitchell Evans. I also have a science fiction short story and a anthology, Twilight Worlds #2, where I was very proud of that particular short story, because I'm gonna go off a little bit here, if it's okay
Go
with you.
for it. Yeah.
I'm older. I grew up on the original Star Trek. And we know, because of budget reasons, they kept running into parallel Earths. Oh, look, it's just like Earth. Oh, look, it's just like Earth. And I had to stop. Well, what if there was a solar? If there's an exact Earth, is there a Mars, a Venus, a Jupiter? Is the whole solar system is the same way? If so, why? And that led to a story about that very concept, that someone has discovered a duplicate of our solar system, and it's called a canvas dark and deep. And I was very proud of how that came up, because that was a more artistic, a more literary story than I normally attempt. And the last thing I'll push here is I have a novel out that was published March 2020. March 2020 was a very bad month to have your debut novel published. As we all know, the world shut down. The world shut down the week my novel came out. But it's called Vulcan. It's called Vulcan's Forge, and it is a science fiction film noir. So very much leaning on the 40s, Double Indemnity, the Maltese Falcon, that sort of film and inspiration, but on a colony world where you have people who are basically trying to recreate America of the mid-50s.
Oh, okay.
And thematically, the question is, how much do you owe society? How much does society owe you? Which I think is always at the heart of a noir, because noir is about characters who are in conflict with our society, their culture.
Right. Well, Bob, that's fantastic. And I'm going to go add that to my TBR as well. And I just want to say, we didn't get to talk about your drink, but you said you are a diet soda drinker. So yes. Cheers to that.
Yeah. I was never much of an alcohol drinker. And then when I developed a particular form of arthritis, my medication goes, well, you can have one drink a month if you want. I'm like, well, I'll just stop drinking.
Right. Not worth it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Bob, so much for being here. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. Watchers, so much for viewing. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks again, Bob.
Thank you very much, Sarah.